a pleasure to be here with everyone on this warm, sunny Boston morning. So the title of my talk has shifted a little bit, but it will become clear very shortly why I did that. So I'm calling this Participatory Design in Digital MRV Systems. Now, jumping straight into it, just as an overview or a recap to make sure all of us are on the same page, what is MRV? So it's this three-step process. Well, actually, let me start with what does participatory mean? I think that's the trickier word here. Just providing the opportunity for individual participation, essentially creating a crowdsourced data system or a system of great data contributors who are all monitoring environmental assets and feeding back into a single system. So MRV is essentially a process, well, it's a three-step process that we've outlined over here. Collecting data, making sure it's in the correct format, and then, well, making sure that students aren't grading their own homework, so in a sense giving it to someone else to verify that, hey, this is indeed the correct result that we're looking for. Now, a lot of this has historically been quite manual, but now we have a lot of new technologies in play that allow us to do what we call digital MRV solutions. I think that's something that most of us in the room, in the building, are quite excited about, representing digital environmental data sets on CO2.storage, collaborating on analysis, processing of this data in a trustless, decentralized computation environment. All of this sourced from cutting-edge tech, smart sensors, satellites, drones, LiDARs, all of that fancy stuff. But a couple weeks back, I gave a talk about some of these interesting DMRV solutions to project developers, primarily in India and South America, and I got a very insightful reaction that I would like to share with everyone. So, these are two images generated by AI, which is essentially capturing this question of, are you just installing robots in our forest, or are you giving our community jobs, training, infrastructure, prosperity? I thought this was extremely insightful. It's not the first, it looks like a very friendly robot, it's plugged into the roots of the forest. Even so, the second picture, I think, is what most of us would agree is what we were trying to get to. So that was the inspiration for this talk, absolutely. That's why I provisionally titled it Incorporating Local Stakeholders, but more broadly, I'm not advocating for any individual solutions, but rather surveying a range of solutions that have this equitable, inclusive MRV format. So, starting with the basics, MRV and digital tools don't have to be all that complicated. You can get a lot done through WhatsApp and through very simple tools. And oftentimes using tools that people already know leads to the highest response rate. As soon as you try to get someone to download a separate app, even if it writes to blockchain directly, that's great, but ultimately using the tools that people are already familiar with often leads to the most results. So for instance, well, the screenshot I've put on the right is from Qualtrics, one of the renowned kind of survey software that's used by a lot of universities and institutions. So I know a project developer, for instance, manages a cook stove project and is connected to about 500,000 beneficiaries on WhatsApp and asks them for questions such as, hey, has the usage of the cook stove decreased your coughing in the household? This is very important to, qualitative but very important data to baseline the project and some of the methodologies, but also corroborate some of the SDG claims that the project developer is offering to the market. So these sort of field surveys are extremely useful. They're definitely qualitative data, which means that people are maybe less likely to pay for it. Even so, it leads to a very high response rate. So now moving from qualitative data to quantitative data, quantitative monetizable DMRV. First, briefly looking at the capital sequence in some of these carbon projects. So external verifiers are already compensated upfront for verifying the credit before it is sold to anybody. So it's already kind of part of the budget within the project itself. Whereas the contributors to the carbon project are, compensated after after the carbon offset is, eventually bought by someone. So it's, regardless of who does or doesn't buy this credit, the MRV is compensated for and is already budgeted. And as we see again on this nice AI-generated image on the right, ultimately, it's a job like any other. It's a job that requires training, equipment, specialized, some specialized knowledge, but ultimately it's a job. So the two questions that this leads me to is, how can we incorporate communities near these projects to equitably participate in these DMRV systems, both tracking and compensating them for their work. But when you're expanding the circle like this, how do you maintain kind of a integrity and quality control in the data that you're consolidating for an environmental asset? There's a lot of different companies that are thinking quite deeply about this. Most of these are in some way associated with Climate Collective, either through membership or grants or just general collaborations. And I haven't spoken much about Climate Collective yet, which is the company that I'm a part of. We are an innovation network of Web3 builders, foundations, scientists, just general collaborators, all together working to unlock verifiable climate action at scale. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to give an overview of how some of these companies are approaching this problem and how they're thinking about participatory DMRV that provides opportunities for individual contribution into these systems. And I'll actually rephrase that, not provides opportunities, but are entirely dependent on contributions from individuals. So the first one I'll start with, which I won't go too deep into because you'll hear from them directly in a couple hours, is Gainforest. So this screenshot that you see over here is the result of a pilot that I believe Alan briefly alluded to by Gainforest, Cello, Protocol Labs, Climate Collective recently in the Philippines. It was a campaign called Measure to Earn, which I think is indicative of the angle or the perspective with which the Gainforest team was trying to approach this to make it very sustainable for the local community. Essentially, it's a system that is able to track and incentivize the collection of data about environmental assets, in this case, trees and mangroves. Like I said, you'll hear directly from them a lot more about this later today, but let's assume that we have a system where we can track and compensate DMRV through the phone pictures. Now the question is, can we extend this to something more physical, something that's very tangible that we can take from the environment? Which brings me to another very promising project that I was working with Climate Collective called SimplexDNA, and the proof of life protocol that they're building for Biodiversity MRV. So remember our AI-generated family up there who's collecting samples in a rainforest. What do you do with those samples then? So this is where the SimplexDNA proof of life protocol takes off. You have this water sample or air sample, you send it to the nearest lab. That from there extracts the DNA. I'm not a geneticist, but it looks, I saw the words PCR over there. It's not dissimilar to a COVID test, essentially how initially the analysis and extraction is done. After that, you sequence the DNA and are able to actually detect, hey, on an empirical level, the species and organisms that are residing in this vicinity. This is something that has not quite happened so far where we have some tools to be able to quantify carbon and soil carbon, carbon that's sequestered in various methodologies, less so for biodiversity. This is really doing it from the DNA, which is ultimately the blueprint of everything that's living there. So this is, assuming now we have this scientific system where you're able to from an air or water sample, quantify what organisms live in this vicinity and in a way quantify the biodiversity state at a given time. Now, how do you build a protocol around this that incentivizes the collection of these data samples, but also maintains a high level of integrity in the system? Slide's a little bit more dense, but this is what we're talking about of a reputational system. So the first bullet point is the goal over here, but I'll illustrate it through the second. Reputation systems, and this is from quotes from an A16Z article, but platform to recognize and incentivize participants' high-quality contributions. So think about Waze. If I join the app Waze, I can report, hey, there's a stop sign ahead or a police officer or whatever it is. And then I get rewarded through an internal reputation system on Waze. And feels great. They've gamified it very well. I think you start as a baby Wazer and then you work your way up like that. But as I contribute more to the system, it realizes that, hey, this guy provides high-quality data. Let's value his contributions internally in the system and him vouching for other people in the system. So mapping this onto Web3, how might that work? So this is, I think, one of the key design choices, and to the title of this talk, participatory 6-syllable word, design. One of the key design choices is decoupling the reputation from the rewards. If you're rewarding people in a token that represents governance or represents your reputation, that they're eventually going to cash out, that doesn't really capture both sides of it. You're only either incentivizing or tracking the reputation. So on Andreessen, the writers there proposed a two-token system. That gets quite complicated operationally, which I will get to shortly, but there's alternate design for this. A lot of us maybe are familiar with soul-bound tokens as a form of tracking reputation on a system. But the bottom line is, yes, you have two parallel tokens that are working within the same system. One that can incentivize and one that can track your reputation over time. So, for example, what are the type of ways? It's contributions to accurate traffic data. But in this case, it's a track record of taking authentic samples, not trying to fool the system at any point, facilitating other participants on the system, bringing them in, maybe helping with some of the technical challenges that they might have in either collecting the sample or sending it back or using these tokens. There's a number of things that you can attribute into someone's reputation here. So this is one of the key design choices for such reputation systems and participatory design. But at the end of all of this, you have this token system that represents verification that, okay, between 2023 and 2025, the biodiversity state in this region has improved. But that doesn't necessarily capture the credits or the efforts associated with creating that change. Which is where the next project that I will talk about, Collectivo and Astro Protocol, two of the kind of founding members of Climate Collective, who are directly monetizing these ecological data tokens. You'll hear more about this in the hackathon as well later today about the geo-NFT and what I like to call geospatially aware financial instruments or money that knows where it is. Through using a lot of great tooling from Astro Protocol. I don't see John X in the room, but otherwise would have given him a shout out. So all to say, Collectivo it's essentially geo-NFTs. You can see it on the right-hand side, kind of how it works high level. You have an NFT that is geographically bound and is tracking an ecological index that accounts for multiple parameters, like part of its carbon, biodiversity, water regeneration, soil, and broader ecosystem services, all layered into an individual plot of land. I think I'm running a little bit on time, so I'm going to skip some of the staking pieces over here, but the idea is that you're able to essentially have a perpetual representation of the ecological state of a certain area, and being able to use funds from staking these data tokens to fund MRV activities and kind of create that closed loop system for each locality here. So, as I mentioned earlier, there were certainly some challenges in some of the real-world pilots that we've been doing, whether it's with Gainforest or with Collectivo or Good Dollar and a number of other Climate Collective partners. A lot of these you can guess, Web3 wallet UX, off-ramps, complexity of some of the protocols. Like I said, two-token systems aren't very easy to understand for most folks. I think two of the key questions that I would like to highlight here are one's about identity. This is where Celo has come up with excellent solutions for integrating your mobile number with the wallet. But even so, once you start operating on the ground, you start seeing that certain families share phones, employees share phones, groups share phones. It's not a perfect one-to-one mapping between a phone number and an identity. So the second piece there is attribution of data. So I think the sub-bullet point illustrates the question of, so there's one, pricing of the carbon offset is high level influenced by how important was the carbon from this offset, versus when you start decentralizing the system and all contributing data, becomes how important is the data that I contributed to verify this offset? Are all these data contributions fungible? Is one contribution more important or more timely or more hard to obtain than others? I don't have an answer there, but I think there's a lot of smart folks thinking about how to design this sort of system. And would be happy to chat about whoever's interested on that respect. And the second piece is about, limited to crypto-friendly jurisdictions at the moment, Curacao, Philippines, some other places like that. But what happens when that's not an issue, when it's an international effort that doesn't have this limitation? So this, early warnings for all, note this is not a company and this is not necessarily associated with Climate Collective yet. I hope we can all converge at a later date. But the focus here is on adaptation instead of mitigation. climate change is already here. This is arguably the largest such participatory DMRV system that we have today. So the goal here is to send alerts to the local population at risk of climate events ahead of time. This is done through a collaboration between many different international government agencies who are combining data. In America, that's NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, and a lot of other comparable government agencies who are using weather stations and other observation centers. And also, funding new infrastructure to be able to monitor blind spots. So this, I think, is a very exciting initiative. Firstly, being able to alert people ahead of time if there is an adverse climate-related event that's going to happen and be able to save lives. But the part that I wanted to highlight here is, again, about the trainings and incorporating. So you have establishing these great centers, and then training of employees to process and apply the information in the local context. And I think that is absolutely crucial here. You can build the robot on the left-hand side, but also give the trainings to people on the right-hand side to know how to use it. And again, similar in the second piece, training to equip people to respond on the ground very quickly based on these early warning systems that they're already trained about. So as I said, this might be just outside the bounds of what some of us work on today, but I do think we're all building very valuable solutions that will converge in the not-so-distant future. So with that, I'll start wrapping up. I think the key takeaways here, the DMRV systems of varying complexity. I think that's quite an important piece. They don't have to be super complicated. Some of them do, some of them don't. But DMRV systems of varying complexity will increase the transparency and participation in markets for entire environmental assets, both on the supply side and on the demand side. Once things are a lot more transparent, it gives buyers a lot more conviction of this is indeed happening. The second piece is that DMRV systems can support the scalable decentralization of data collection, processing, validation, compensation as well. I think we'll hear a lot more about CO2 storage and the interesting use cases that a lot of different companies have done for, to illustrate the scalable decentralization of the collection and processing particularly. Then the third piece is that participatory design, providing opportunities for individuals to contribute to systems, also presents opportunities for jobs, training, infrastructure, and, as Cello calls it, prosperity for all.